Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for Literature and Coping Skills. I'm back again with a new lecture, that is emotional well-being. If you remember, in our last meeting I told you all that I'm going to talk about emotional well-being from a new and different perspective so that we can extend our ideas of emotional well-being in a new manner. So let's start. Before I start, I must tell you all that we talked about well-being in our last lecture, understanding emotions, and what exactly we mean by emotional well-being. So when we talked about well-being, I started with how the WHO has defined well-being as a holistic state of happiness and contentment, and then I took you yet further to understanding of emotions, and thereby I talked about basic human emotions, basic theories of human emotion, and a few other things. Then we switched to emotional well-being, where I talked about how emotional well-being is perceived, how we need to understand the very idea of emotional well-being, and a variety of other things. So today I'm going to talk about emotional well-being from a new perspective, and we are going to focus on these important aspects of emotional well-being. The first thing that I'm going to talk about today is the role of emotions in our lives, how emotions play such an important role in our lives. The second thing that I'm going to talk about today is emotional processes, so that we understand how they happen, how they occur, how they arise in us, and what we can do in order to take care of each of them. The third thing that I'm going to focus on is understanding emotions again, but through a different perspective today. It's not going to be the same kind of understanding that I talked about in our last meeting. The fourth thing that I'm going to talk about today is emotional awareness. This is one of the most important things, because this is the thing that's going to help us a lot in our functioning of everyday life. So it's very important that we get to know, we become aware of our emotions. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about today is emotion regulation. So if you look at the whole thing, you'll see a distinct pattern, a distinct movement from stage 1 to stage 5. So first we need to understand how emotions play an important role in our lives. Then we need to understand the emotional processes, and we also need to understand emotions as well, so that we can develop emotional awareness in ourselves. And this emotional awareness will lead us to proper management of those emotions, proper regulation of those emotions, so that we can control our emotions in a way so that it leads to our well-being. So emotional well-being can actually be derived or acquired through these important stages. So let's start with each of these stages. The first thing that I'm going to talk about today is the role of emotions in our lives. So the moment I ask you this question, emotions help us, and if I ask you to complete this statement, this expression, you'll suddenly begin to think about a variety of things. So emotions, of course, they help us in a variety of ways. So you might have got a few responses by now. So let's take a look at some of these responses. I must tell you that these responses are not exhaustive. You can always add to this list. They are very, very indicative in nature. They give us an idea. The first thing that we can think about emotions is this. So emotions perform important life functions. Life functions because we are living beings, we exist, we have to be functional. If we are not so, we become dysfunctional. So we cannot afford that. So emotions perform important life functions, starting with mating and reproducing, to taking flight from fear, protecting ourselves, expressing our concern, affection for people around us, and sometimes expressing jealousy, envy, a variety of things. So emotions perform important life functions. Emotions determine the ways in which we think and behave. For example, the fight or flight responses. I'm suddenly faced with a danger, so I may decide to fight, or I may decide to take a flight. So go away or move away from that danger. So in both cases, I'm allowing some of my emotions to come into play so that I can allow myself to be affected by those emotions and act or respond in a certain manner. So emotions determine the ways in which we think and behave. The third important thing is emotions motivate us to act. They motivate us to act, because without emotions, we cannot feel like acting. So they become driving forces. They are energy fields, so they motivate us to act. So therefore, it's important that we understand that our emotions also motivate us to act. The next is emotions help us survive existential challenges, because it's very, very important for us to survive existential challenges. If you remember, I talked about existential challenges, those 5 big existential challenges, if you remember them, starting with death, going to meaning, or meaninglessness as well. So when it comes to surviving existential challenges, our emotions play a very, very important role. They help us do so. So whether it's protecting yourself from danger, or responding to a certain situation so that we can survive, we can protect our existence, emotions play an important role in all these activities. And then emotions determine our decision making as well, because most often we have heard that do not use emotions while making decisions. But then people today believe that emotions play a very, very important role in the decision making process. So therefore, emotions determine our decision making as well. And then finally, emotions help us develop our interpersonal relationships. We all know that we cannot live alone. I have already talked about it. So therefore, we need to have friends. We need to establish connections with humans around us and other things as well. So when it comes to interpersonal relationships, we actually need our emotions to strengthen those relationships. So if we do not take care of those emotions, they can also lead to the straining of those interpersonal relationships. So therefore, emotions help us develop and strengthen our interpersonal relationships. And that brings us to the idea of emotional processes. I have already told you that emotional processes are very, very important to our understanding of emotions, their importance in our lives, and their relevance to our emotional well-being. So therefore, it's important that we understand emotional processes very, very well. So I have used a definition from the American Psychological Association, which has defined emotion as a complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavioral, and physiological elements. So these 3 elements are very, very important for our understanding of emotions. And before that, let me tell you that it's a complex reaction pattern. It's a very complex reaction pattern because most often it eludes, escapes our understanding. So that's why it's a very, very complex reaction pattern, because it involves so many components: the experiential, the behavioral, and the physiological elements as well. So since it passes through various stages, it involves various elements or components, it becomes complex. And it's a reaction pattern because whenever we experience an emotion in us, that leads to a kind of feeling, and then that leads to some kind of a reaction or response. So therefore, it's important that we understand the emotional processes well. The second is subjective experiences, we'll know, physiological responses and behavioral responses. So when it comes to subjective experiences, physiological responses and behavioral responses, we need to understand how our emotional responses in fact pass through these distinct stages. It can be a subjective experience. I come across an experience that leads to some kind of emotion in me, and then leads to some kind of feeling in me. So that's purely subjective, the way I approached, the way I understood it. There are certain physiological responses as well that are very, very natural, that are very, very spontaneous, because I don't have to do much about it, because we have a system that responds spontaneously to a certain stimuli. And then there are behavioral responses as well. We need to understand that when it comes to the final response stage, it's the behavioral responses that matter the most. The way we respond, the way we behave, or the way the emotions change our behavior. So that is how we come to the idea, the whole cycle, the movement. It all starts with an experience that leads to the arousal of a certain kind of emotion, and that emotion generates a certain kind of feeling in us, and that feeling requires that we express our experience. So from experience to expression, that is how emotional processes take place. I can explain subjective experiences in greater detail, because it's very, very important that we understand each of these three different types of responses or experiences. So we humans experience basic emotions quite regularly. We cannot stop them from happening to us, therefore they are so basic to us. At the same time, we also express those basic emotions regularly, and these experiences that produce those basic emotions are in fact subjective. So therefore, we cannot take our eyes off the subjective experiences. And then we come to the physiological responses. So that's exactly where the neurological aspects also come into play. The autonomic nervous system, which is very popularly called the ANS system, that is very, very reciprocal or inhibitory effects. It's a combination of reciprocal and inhibitory effects, because it responds automatically. I've already told you that there is a spontaneous response mechanism when it comes to physiological responses. For example, you suddenly come across a ferocious tiger, that will definitely lead to the racing of your heartbeat. That might also lead to sweating and a variety of other things. So when that happens, we know that the autonomic nervous system is functional, is acting. The autonomic nervous system has two different sets of nervous systems. The first is a sympathetic nervous system, SNS. This regulates our fight or flight response. That means the sympathetic nervous system suddenly gets focused on the stimulus, and that leads to some kind of arousal or emotional arousal in us. So therefore, it regulates the fight or flight response in us. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, restores the body to a resting state. For example, when sympathetic nervous system is active, or it gets activated suddenly, that leads to a variety of physiological changes in us. That may be the racing of heart, palpitation, sweating, and a variety of other things. But the parasympathetic nervous system helps us cool down, return to a resting state, or helps the body return to a resting state. That means when the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, that will definitely help us relax, calm down, so that our heartbeat, our anxiety level, all these things calm down. But the question is, when the parasympathetic system is not activated and we continue to be in the SNS mode, the sympathetic nervous system mode, that will lead to a lot of problems. We'll continue to experience anxiety, palpitation, sweating, heartbeat, and a lot of other things as well. So therefore, it's important that we understand these physiological processes related to emotions. And then we come to behavioral responses. I have already told you all that. When it comes to behavioral responses, it has to do with the expression of emotions, how exactly we express our emotions. So we all know that we express our emotions in a variety of ways. So we may be angry, but we may not express anger in a certain fixed manner. We may express anger in a variety of ways. So what kind of behavioral response we choose depends a lot on how far we have been, or how successfully we have been able to take note of our emotions. So these behavioral responses are vital to the well-being of individuals, to our well-being. So that's exactly where our well-being rests. Our well-being rests on our behavioral responses. So we are going to experience emotions, because those emotions will definitely be aroused in us. We cannot stop, we cannot help it. But when it comes to responding to those emotions, expressing those emotions, we need to take utmost care. Otherwise, that will lead to problems. And that's the reason why people who do not know how to express their emotions properly or well, they always run into troubles. They have strained relationships, they lead a very dejected life, a bad social relationship, and a variety of other things. So that causes problems for them. Therefore, it's important for us to understand emotions. So we have moved from these emotional processes to our understanding of emotions. It's important that we understand how emotions play a very, very significant role in our existence, in our lives, everyday life, and how we need to take care of those experiences, those feelings, so that we know how to exercise restraint over our emotions. So, in order for that to happen to us, we need to understand emotions very, very well. So, this understanding of emotions is an extension of the understanding of emotions that I talked about in my last lecture. So, let's take a look at this. So, it's very, very clear to all of us that energy fields. Emotions are energy fields. They drive us. The moment a certain kind of emotion is aroused me, I can experience that energy in me. So whether it's an emotion that has a positive valence or an emotion that has a negative valence, irrespective of the valence, irrespective of its kind, whether it's positive or negative, the moment an emotion is aroused in me, I can experience that energy. For example, if I'm angry, I'll feel like hitting people, beating them, bashing them, throwing things, and do a lot of things, because I can experience that energy in me. Similarly, if the emotion of love is aroused in me, I'll feel like doing things for people, caring for them, and a variety of other things. So both ways, whether it has a positive valence or a negative valence, both ways emotions play a very, very important role because they drive us. Therefore, they are energy fields. And there is no doubt about this particular thing, that emotions have serious implications for our mental and physical health. If we do not know how to take care of our emotions, because we do not even understand our emotions, that means we'll have a poor emotional management system, and that will definitely result in poor mental and physical health. Poor mental health may lead to sleeplessness, anxiety, depression, and a variety of other problems. And once we are faced with these problems, that will definitely affect our physical health as well. So there is no doubt about it that emotions have serious implications for our mental and physical health. So emotions are fundamentally constructive, and that's one of the finest things about emotions. They are fundamentally constructive. If you remember, I talked about how we humans are designed in a manner evolutionarily that we always want to return to the safe mode. We do not want to be in the survival mode for long. So, and I cited an example, if you push somebody into water suddenly, the person will not, stay quiet. The person will definitely flutter his or her hands to move out of that problem, the danger. So that's one of the finest things about us, that we always want to return to the safe mode so that we can feel relaxed, happy, and contented. Similarly, emotions are also fundamentally constructive. They help us construct our lives in a certain manner, positively. But then the problem is they can also be destructive, and we all know that. Our emotions, the same emotions that can make us, can also destroy us. So therefore, emotions can also be destructive. So therefore, we need to understand emotions well. Whenever our emotions tend to become destructive, that means we have not been able to understand them well. So therefore, that's a problem. And then being in touch with our emotions is one of the finest things, one of the best things that we can do with ourselves, so that we are constantly in touch with our emotions, because that is the beginning of our emotional awareness. So emotional awareness, I must tell you all, that is a wonderful thing. It's such an important thing that we all need to cultivate. So emotional awareness is something that will help us take note of our emotions, understand them, observe the emotional processes, and then devise certain strategies through which we can regulate or manage our emotions. So if we know how to manage our emotions, then that will be the best thing to happen. And management of emotions cannot happen until and unless we become aware of our emotions. So therefore, it's important that we are constantly in touch with our emotions. So emotional awareness is one of the most important things, because it plays an important role in the cycle of survival. You all know by now that we always struggle with this cycle of survival, because we have to survive. There are various other factors that are there to challenge our survival. So therefore, it's important that we learn how to survive. So our emotional awareness helps us in the cycle of survival. For example, I know that love is important in my life because it will lead to procreation and the preservation of my species. I know that fear is equally important. I must be afraid of dangers so that I think of protecting myself, and I can preserve myself, my existence, my species. So, when it comes to survival questions, emotional awareness becomes very, very important. Even when it comes to the question of taking note of those emotions that are distressing me, that are disturbing me, that are challenging my very existence. It can be anxiety, stress, depression, and a variety of other things. We all know about those disorders, those mental disorders that can quickly challenge my survival. So therefore, it's important that we develop emotional awareness, because it also forms the core of our well-being. If I'm emotionally aware, I can ensure my well-being because I know what it is. And we all know that knowledge or information reduces uncertainty. Until and unless I'm aware of my emotions, I will continue to be uncertain about those. And the moment I become aware of my emotions, that uncertainty will gradually disappear. And once that disappears, my well-being will be ensured. The third is emotional awareness determines an individual's level of emotional functioning. We all know by now that we are emotional beings as well. So we have a physical state and an emotional state as well. So this physical state requires that we keep fit physically. Similarly, the emotional state also requires that we keep fit emotionally, so that our emotional functioning is regulated, becomes proper. It doesn't lead to problems. Otherwise, it will be dysfunctional and will definitely lead to problems. So, emotional awareness also helps us deal with repressed emotions, because if once we become aware of those things, we can bring those repressed emotions back to our awareness and deal with them. So it's all about dealing with emotions regularly, so that those emotions do not begin to disturb us or distress us. So if I have emotional awareness, I can deal with even those repressed emotions which I may not be aware of otherwise. I can deal with those emotions. Otherwise, those repressed emotions will come up to disturb me, to distress me. So that's the reason why it's important that I become emotionally aware. This is a very, very important thing. It has been found and it has been established through research that if somebody has low emotional awareness, the person runs the risk or the danger of remaining in the survival mode. That means he'll continue to experience those disturbing and distressing emotions, and you'll not be able to come out of those situations. You'll always find yourself in the survival mode, and that will also lead to burnout. You'll run out of energy and you'll feel as if you are useless, your life is a waste, and that will lead to various other problems as well. So therefore, it's important that we always aim at developing high emotional awareness, because that ensures performance. Whenever you find yourself in challenging situations, your performance is going to rescue you. Your performance is going to help you come out of that and survive those challenges. So, if you have high emotional awareness, that will lead to performance and recovery. So you can quickly spring back to the safe mode after recovering from the survival mode. So your recovery depends a lot on the level of your emotional awareness. If it is high, the recovery rate is also high and the performance level also goes up, peaks. If your emotional awareness is low, you'll always struggle in the survival mode, you'll experience burnout and a variety of other problems. So therefore, emotional awareness is important. Just to explain why emotional awareness is important, there's an example. You can see we always start with a situation. For example, the situation is you are criticized at work. The situation is the thing that triggers the problem, that pushes you to the survival state. So the situation, for example, in this case, the situation is that you have been criticized at work. So that particular experience will lead to some thoughts in you. So this can be one of those thoughts that you may have, that I'm not good at work, I'm not good enough, I'm useless. So when that thought arises in you, that will lead to some kind of emotion. Okay, so you can question, how do I feel? The answer may be, I feel I'm useless, worthless, and I feel I'm anxious, I'm stressed, a variety of other things. And that particular feeling will lead to some kind of behavior. If you remember, I have already talked about all these things. So what do I do now? I'll avoid contact with others. I'll withdraw. I'll not participate. And then that will lead to some physical reactions as well. You will experience burnout syndrome, even loss of appetite. You'll feel dejected and you'll not feel like doing anything. You'll suddenly experience a total loss of energy. And that will lead to a vicious cycle. Therefore, emotional awareness is very, very important. One can always, re-narrate the entire story and change the plot. So therefore, it's very popular to say that change your narrative and change your life. So you can easily change this particular thing by saying that, okay, I have been criticized at work. The thoughts can be modified. Why was I criticized? Was it a single instance or it is a regular happening? You need to, think about that particular experience in a different or through a different perspective. And if that happens, that will lead to different kinds of emotions. And if we have different kinds of emotions, we may have different types of behavior. And that will lead to certain kind of physiological responses as well. And those physiological responses may not be as dangerous, distressing as these ones. So therefore, it's very important that we become emotionally aware so that we can break this vicious cycle from taking place. That brings us to the idea of emotion regulation. This is also alternately referred to as emotional or emotion management. So emotion regulation is one of the best things that we can do to ensure our emotional well-being, to take care of ourselves. So this is one of the biggest reasons why emotion regulation or emotion management is so important, because of the dynamic nature of human emotions and the pervasive role they play in all experiences. Emotion regulation skills are fundamental to everyday functioning. I have already told you that we are functional beings. We are either functional or dysfunctional. Dysfunctional means we do not exist. we are as good as dead. So we cannot do that. Therefore, we are functional beings. So in order to continue as functional beings, in order to ensure everyday functioning in a proper manner, it's important that we understand the nature of human emotions. Emotions are dynamic and they are pervasive. They're dynamic, they keep changing. I may be happy now, after 30 minutes or an hour, I may be sad, I may be crying. I cannot ensure that I'll continue to be happy forever. I may be sad now, maybe the next moment I'll be angry, and the next moment I'll be jealous. So that's the reason why emotions are so dynamic in nature. So when something is so dynamic in nature, it's not an easy task to manage those things. But we need to manage through awareness. We need to regulate. But this can happen when we understand that emotions are dynamic in nature. And we also need to understand that they're very, very pervasive in nature. They're so powerful. And that's the reason why I call them energy fields. They're so powerful. And when something is very, very powerful, so forceful, it requires a great amount of strength to control, to check. In this case, you need a great amount of mental strength to check the pervasiveness of your emotions, the dynamic nature of your emotions. So once we do that, once we begin to do that, that is what we mean by emotion regulation or emotion management. Because that will lead to the cultivation or development of an ability to respond and manage emotion, to respond to those emotions and manage them. Now we are able, I'm able, I know how to manage my emotions. I know that I'll also have disturbing emotions. I cannot guarantee or ensure that I'll continue to have positive, exhilarating emotions. That may not happen. I may also have disturbing and distressing emotions, and I should be prepared for those emotions. That preparedness will be acquired once we know, once we become aware. And this is a very, very famous emotion regulation strategy, catharsis. You might have heard about catharsis. It's become a catchphrase now. People use the word catharsis in everyday transactions so popularly that, like narrative, the word catharsis has promptly moved into popular lingo. But we need to understand catharsis from a different perspective. Catharsis, as we know, occurred in the writings of the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. But we're not going to talk about catharsis from that perspective. We're going to focus on catharsis for its importance or relevance to our understanding of emotion regulation. We all know that catharsis plays an important role in relieving symptoms of distress. What exactly is catharsis? It's the purgation of excessive emotions, purification. It's also alternately called cleansing. Although many people prefer the idea of purgation or purification. So, purgation or purification means the excessive emotion that has become pervasive in us needs to be released safely so that we can allow our PNS, parasympathetic nervous system, to help us relax and calm down. Catharsis has two very important components. Emotional component, because it helps us experience those strong emotions and release them or express them. It has an emotional component. Similarly, it also has a cognitive component, because catharsis also helps us develop an insight into that particular experience. And that is exactly what we take away with us. That's a takeaway. We develop an insight into one particular experience. So therefore, catharsis is very, very important. Catharsis, as I've already told, cleansing, it leads to positive changes in our lives. Because catharsis will mean that your PNS system is activated and you're fast returning to your calmed state, resting state, fast, rapidly. That means you are recovering. You're quickly returning to a safe mode. So therefore, catharsis is very, very important. I'll quickly take you through the idea of emotion regulation and the strategies that are involved in the process. There are two aspects to it. The first is emotion generation process. We always come across a situation. It can be a real or an imagined situation. I may have a thought of danger in my mind and I may experience a certain kind of fear in me. I may have a thought of love, affection in my mind, I'll experience a certain kind of emotion. Or it can be a real situation. So situation leads to the generation of emotion, and that requires our attention. So the moment we come to the situation mode, that means our attention is also required. So if it's a positive kind of situation, I mean a situation that generates positive emotion in me, that will definitely require a positive attention from me. If it's a negative kind of situation, then that requires negative type of approach. But then when it comes to adopting a negative approach to a certain situation, that may lead to problems as well for the individual and for people around you. Therefore, the appraisal state is very important, because that's exactly where we evaluate and interpret that particular emotional situation. Stage 1, emotional situation. We begin to evaluate that situation and then try to interpret, try to make sense of it. And that brings us to the response stage. So the response stage makes it that an emotional response is generated, and that alters experiential, behavioral and physiological response systems as well. And interestingly, the response state also leads to the situation state again. Therefore, it starts from the beginning again, because for example, if your response is one of harm or anger, it will again return to the situation state and lead through all these stages in a different way. So therefore, it's important that we understand. And now we come to the emotion regulation strategies. The first is situation selection. We can select the situation. For example, if the situation is a challenging one, emotionally challenging one, you can prefer to disengage. But disengagement is a maladaptive approach. It's not an adaptive approach. You're disengaging from that situation. So the situation will disappear for a moment, but it may return to haunt you. So you can also think of engagement with that situation. The next is situation modification, in which you can think of altering the situation so that you can take away some of its intensity. For example, the moment you realize that something is leading to some kind of conflict, you can suddenly alter that particular situation by bringing in humor, by taking away the attention of people to something else. So that can. So most often people say, let's change the topic. If the topic is turning out to be a challenging one, you can change the topic. So that is an alteration. So this is an adaptive approach. It's not a maladaptive approach. Then attention deployment. Attention deployment passes through various stages. It can be distraction. You may distract. For example, a particular type of emotion is disturbing you. You may take your attention off that emotion. You may distract yourself so that you are not disturbed. But distraction is not going to help in the long run, because you'll have to come to face to face with that emotion. Then rumination. Rumination is an excessive focus on that particular emotion and its effects. So rumination is very, very maladaptive in nature. Worry, we all know, it's also maladaptive. Thought suppression, that is also maladaptive. You're going to suppress your thoughts. So all these deployment strategies can be extremely maladaptive. Therefore, we need to understand that we develop certain strategies that are adaptive in nature. So what exactly can we do? Because these are natural responses. We try to distract, we try to ruminate, we get worried, and we try to suppress our thoughts. But then this is something that helps us develop certain positive and adaptive strategies. Cognitive change starts with reappraisal. We can reappraise the entire situation. For example, your friend was angry, and when you met your friend, he uttered certain harsh words to you, and you didn't like that. So you might think that that is the end of your friendship. You become angry with your friend. How can he say that to me? If you appraise, that might lead to problems. You give yourself some time and reappraise that situation. The first question that you can ask here is, why did he say that? He never talked to me in that manner. Then you begin to reappraise the entire situation. He must have been passing through an emotional challenge, some kind of disturbance. Then you can also recall your wonderful days that you spent together and a variety of other things. So reappraisal always helps you develop an insight into problems. Even distancing, you distance yourself from that challenging moment, situation. You get some time to think about it from different perspectives. And then I have already told you that humor can play a very important role in diffusing the negativity of a situation or negative emotions, distressing emotions. And then we come to the last one, that is response modulation, the last strategy, response modulation. So there is one type of response modulation which is not an adaptive one, that is expressive suppression. So you go on suppressing your expressive need, your expressive desire. There are people who also quickly go to drug use because they think that drug is going to nullify, numb my senses so that I will not experience any disturbing or disturbing emotions. But these two are maladaptive practices or approaches. The next two, exercise and sleep, are adaptive practices. So exercise helps us overcome. It can be exercise of any kind. It can be breathing exercise, it can be yoga, meditation, mindfulness meditation, heartfulness meditation, a variety of things. So it can be an exercise that will help you, return to your body, reflect on your body, your mind, so that you can return to your safe mode. And then sleep, we all know, is a wonderful revitalizer. So that can be an adaptive response modulation. So these are some of these strategies that people generally adopt in order to regulate or manage their emotions. These ideas are based on a very famous process model that was developed by James Gross, and he in fact informed us how we can develop certain regulation strategies, so that we can take care of those emotional challenges. So that is how we come to the end of our discussion of emotional well-being, and I hope you might have liked this discussion. And I must also tell you all that emotion is such a huge area in itself that we cannot cover it in just 1 or 2 lectures. But then I have tried to focus on all those important aspects or components of emotion, so that you come face to face with emotions, how they affect our lives, and how we need to regulate or manage those emotions so that we can ensure our well-being. So in my next lecture, I'm going to talk about personality, so that we get to know how we as individuals approach these issues from a different perspectives. So thank you very much for joining me.